The baby was small, smaller than any babe had a right to be, born too soon beneath a blood-orange sky in the raw edge of March. Snow clung to the grass like forgotten lace, melting slow, leaving the ground sodden and dark. She had no name ready, no swaddling quilt passed down from mother to daughter, just a wool shawl she tore in half in a voice gone hoarse from pain and silence. Clara buried her daughter beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the old trail that once carried wagons west, where the river crooned to itself and the trunks twisted skyward like arms reaching for mercy. The grave was shallow, she hadn't the strength for more, and the earth was stubborn with frost. Her hands bled where she'd clawed it open, and she pressed her palms flat against the soil after, as if to soothe it, as if to hush her own trembling. No one had come with her, no one had stayed. The child's father had been long gone, a man of reckless charm and borrowed names, gone east for work that never wrote back. The townfolk, if you could call them that, half-wild and scattered, had offered what meager things they could in wordless glances, not daring to touch sorrow so fresh. A bucket of broth left on her porch, a flannel scrap folded neat, no prayers. That morning Clara walked from the cabin barefoot. She hadn't spoken in days. She hadn't cried. Grief was a slow animal in her chest, crawling along her ribs with quiet claws. The grave lay beneath the last cottonwood, its bark a silver ghost in the thawing dawn, and she sat beside it, arms wrapped around her knees, cheek against her shoulder. She did not plan to return to the cabin. There was nothing in it for her now but echoes and ash. The firewood was gone, and with it the will to keep warm. She would sit with her daughter and let the wind decide. By dusk her toes were blue and the light fled fast behind the hills. Shadows spilled down the trunks like ink, and the river's song grew louder in the hush. Her body trembled with cold, but she didn't move. Somewhere a coyote called and was answered. Then came the sound of hooves on the trail. Slow, deliberate, she stiffened. Her hands reached instinctively toward the hem of her dress, where a paring knife had once been hidden, long since lost. She expected a man with hunger in his eyes or questions on his tongue. Instead, a horse stopped just beyond the trees, and a figure dismounted, tall, wrapped in a coat heavy with travel and dust. The stranger said nothing at first, only walked a wide arc around her as if not to startle, leading the horse with reins slack. He saw the mound, the disturbed soil. He paused. Then, without asking, he set his saddle down a dozen paces away, knelt, and began to gather dry limbs and twigs, stacking them with a care that made her throat tighten. When he struck the flint, sparks leapt like fireflies, and within moments a small flame danced to life, crackling. The stranger sat beside it, not too close to her, but close enough she felt its warmth brush her feet. Still, he did not speak. And Clara, too hollow for words, let the fire speak for them both. The fire licked upward with slow confidence, casting orange light onto bark and bone and the rough edges of the stranger's face. Clara watched from her place in the dirt, her breath ragged and shallow. He did not look at her, not directly, only fed the flames methodically, like a man who'd done it 1,000 times in places lonelier than this. The cold in her feet had turned from biting to numb. She flexed her toes and felt nothing. A part of her welcomed that. Another part, quieter and more stubborn, shifted her weight toward the heat. He saw it, noted it with a glance, not a word, and reached into his pack. When he tossed the blanket toward her, it landed short. She stared at it, the coarse wool heavy with trail dust, until her fingers reached out on their own and dragged it close. That night passed in silence. Coyotes grew bold as the moon climbed, their cries sharp and layered. The fire hissed as frost melted from the logs. Once the man stirred to tend it, murmuring something soft to his horse tied nearby. Clara did not sleep. She sat and watched the flame bend in the wind and thought of the infant beneath her feet, wrapped in half a shawl, her face already fading in memory. At some point near dawn, the man removed his coat and laid it around her shoulders without asking. His eyes met hers, steady and dark. "You're freezing," he said, voice low, like gravel under water. Clara blinked. The sound of another's voice felt foreign, like music from a land she'd forgotten. "I buried her yesterday," she answered, hoarse. "Had to wait till the ground softened." He didn't offer comfort, only nodded once, grave as the earth between them. He looked down at the mound and tipped his hat. "Was she your first?" Clara's throat closed. She looked away. She was mine. The fire cracked, sending up a burst of sparks like shooting stars. The stranger leaned back on his heels, quiet again. They didn't speak more that morning. When the light came, pale and reluctant, she rose stiffly, unwrapped from the coat and blanket, and walked to the river to wash her hands. Mud clung to her skin, half frozen. She scrubbed until her knuckles were red. When she returned, the man was boiling coffee in a blackened tin pot. He handed her a dented mug without ceremony. It was bitter, strong enough to rouse something that had lain still inside her. "You headed anywhere?" he asked. Clara shook her head. He nodded toward the trail. "I'll be going north when the sun's full. Don't plan to stay long, just needed a place to rest the horse." She didn't answer. He hadn't asked her to go with him, just as well. But that evening, when he unpacked beans and salt pork, he cooked enough for two, and she, not knowing why, sat beside him again. They ate with their knees touching, not speaking. The wind softened, the river sang. And though the grave remained at the edge of their camp, Clara found herself looking less at the soil and more at the man's hands as they worked. Not longing, not hope, just noticing. Spring came in fits like a skittish animal. One day the wind would be warm, carrying the scent of damp cedar and new grass, and the next, frost crept back across the ground as if the land had changed its mind. The cottonwoods budded slowly, their branches heavy with waiting. Clara remained by the grave, and the man remained by the fire. He told her his name on the fifth day. "Jonah," he said simply, while whittling a strip of pine into something shapeless. Clara only nodded. She didn't offer hers. Name still felt too fragile. But later, when he was down by the river, brushing his horse, she whispered it aloud to the wind, just to hear how it sounded beside her own. Jonah was a quiet man, but not the kind of quiet that hung heavy. He moved with the rhythm of someone used to listening more than speaking, and when he did talk, it was with a calm that made her chest ease. He never asked why she stayed or where she'd come from. He built the fire each night and shared whatever he had: beans, coffee, dried apples gone soft in the heat. Once, a strip of jerky so tough they laughed. Or rather, he laughed and she smiled, which was more than she'd done in weeks. She began to mend her hands. The scabs from digging peeled away, revealing pink skin beneath. She rubbed salve on the raw patches and let them heal without apology. She walked more, sometimes along the riverbank, where cattails grew and frogs began to stir in the meltwater. The cabin still stood back up the trail, but she hadn't gone near it since. One afternoon, Jonah returned with a bundle of kindling and found her digging again near the grave, not to bury, but to plant. She'd found a packet of wildflower seeds tucked into her coat, saved from last summer's barter in town. She sprinkled them into the broken earth and pressed them down with the flat of her palm. He didn't interrupt, only came beside her, knelt, and helped without a word. Later, by the fire, she finally spoke. "I was 17 when I left home," she said. Her voice was thin, like the first thread of smoke rising from damp wood. "Jonah didn't move. Ran from a man who called himself a preacher, wore silver buttons, and said I was chosen." Her jaw tensed. The firelight made her cheekbones sharp as flint. "Found myself further west with every season, always further. Then came John." She looked at Jonah then, eyes narrowed. He wasn't a bad man, just didn't know how to stay. Jonah's eyes stayed on the flames. "Some men don't," he said. Silence fell again, but it was different now, shared, as if he'd made space for her grief beside his own. That night, as the fire waned, he laid his coat around her shoulders again. But this time, his hand lingered at her back, not a grasp, just a weight, a grounding. And Clara, eyes closed, did not pull away. The wildflowers came up slow, first as fragile green shoots, then stems that reached and trembled in the breeze. Clara knelt beside them daily, clearing twigs and debris, her fingers gentler now. She spoke to them sometimes in a low murmur, not words of hope or prayer, but simple things: weather, soil, the habits of the sparrows that nested nearby. As if the ground could remember kindness, too. Jonah began leaving after dawn some mornings, taking the trail north with a rifle slung across his back. He never said where he went, but he always came back before dusk, horse-lathered and his coat smelling of pine and iron. He brought things: a bundle of dried nettle, a bundle of rabbit skins, once a spool of thread and a tin of lard. Things that couldn't be found in the clearing. She began to sew again, a long tear in the hem of her dress, a lining for her boots. The act felt strangely holy, like stitching herself back together one loop at a time. It rained hard one afternoon, sudden and cold. The fire was no use and the grave turned to mud. Jonah unlashed a canvas from his pack and strung it between the trees. They huddled beneath it, shoulder to shoulder, watching water trail down like glass beads. Clara shivered, her dress soaked through, and Jonah leaned in, just enough for their arms to press together. She spoke without looking at him. "You have people." He was quiet a moment. "Had a brother once, died in the bitterroots. Avalanche took the whole ridge." She waited, the silence stretched. "Before that we broke horses," he said. "Made enough to eat, not enough to stop." Clara turned her face toward the storm. "That what you're doing now, breaking things?" Jonah's jaw worked. "Maybe I'm looking for something that doesn't run when you reach it." The wind shifted, trees moaned in the distance. Clara said nothing, but her breath came sharp and quick. That night when the fire finally lit again, she brought out a small bundle from beneath her sleeping tarp. Inside was a hand-stitched bonnet, barely finished, the stitches uneven and clumsy. She placed it near the grave, weighted with a smooth stone. Jonah watched but said nothing. 2 nights later, a fox came close to the camp, eyes glinting like coals in the dark. Clara reached for the rifle. Her fingers wrapped around the stock steady as breath, but she did not fire. She held it until the fox turned and disappeared into the woods. When she looked over, Jonah was watching her, not with surprise, but with quiet respect. "You ever think of leaving?" he asked the next morning as they shared the last of the beans. Clara ran her thumb along the rim of the tin cup. "I did once. I ran all the way here." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe you stopped running." She didn't answer, but the words sat in her chest like a seed waiting for warmth. By the end of that week, she asked him to teach her how to snare. Her hands, still learning gentleness, now practiced survival. And Jonah, wordless as ever, smiled with his eyes and showed her where to set the line. By mid-April, the cottonwoods bloomed, tufts of green softening the sky like a promise. The grave was no longer a raw wound in the earth, but a place that breathed quietly beside them. Wildflowers stretched up, yellow and pale blue, their petals trembling with each gust of wind. Clara kept tending them, even when the river swelled from snowmelt and their camp had to shift higher. Jonah found her one morning standing at the edge of the rise, her face turned into the wind, hair loose and tangled down her back. She didn't speak, but when he came beside her, she reached for his hand, not to hold, just to touch. His fingers curled around hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. They made a shelter from felled limbs and canvas, something more permanent than the linta they'd slept under. Jonah showed her how to notch joints so they wouldn't slip in the rain. Clara gathered moss for the roof and tied willow fronds for lashing. By evening, her palms were blistered, but she didn't complain. The ache felt right, felt earned. Inside the finished frame, Jonah unrolled his bedroll and then stepped back, waiting. Clara stood at the threshold, looking at the small space. There was no door, just canvas draped for privacy. She stepped in without a word, laid her own blanket beside his and sat, not for the night, just to be there. That was the rhythm of them now, nothing asked, nothing demanded. A look, a shared chore, the slow weaving of habit into meaning. One morning, Jonah returned from the trail with a gash across his arm, dark and crusted. "Cat," he said simply, sitting down as if it weren't worth mentioning. Clara knelt beside him, jaw set. "You didn't tell me you were hunting that far." He winced as she poured hot water over the wound. "Didn't figure you'd stop me." "I wouldn't have," she said, "but I'd have sent you with more than luck." She dressed the wound with clean linen she'd washed that week in the river. Her hands were steady now, tender without flinching. When she tied the last knot, Jonah caught her wrist lightly. "You look different," he said. Clara tilted her head, uncertain. "How?" "Like someone who stayed." The words hit her harder than she expected. She looked down at the wound she'd wrapped, then back up at him. "I still wake at night thinking she's cold." Jonah's hand didn't move. "She is." That night Clara sat at the grave alone. The moon cast silver shadows through the trees, and the wind carried the sound of distant water. She spoke aloud for the first time in weeks. Her name was Elia. She felt something shift in the air, not presence but peace, a loosening, and when she rose, the ache in her knees felt bearable. Back at the shelter, Jonah was asleep, breath slow and even. She lay beside him, close but not touching, and in the hush of the dark, her hand found his beneath the blanket. He didn't stir, but his fingers closed around hers. The sun came early now, long before the first birds called. It slid through the canvas and painted their faces with gold. Clara woke to it, not startled but still, the way one wakes in a place they trust. Jonah was already gone, but his coat remained beside her, folded with care. Outside, the wildflowers had bloomed fully, petals wide, trembling on slender stems, a riot of soft color over the grave. Clara knelt beside them, pressing her palm to the warm earth, not in grief this time, but in recognition. The girl beneath had not been forgotten. She had been honored with survival. Jonah returned near midday with 2 snares full and a quiet smile beneath his stubble. He set the rabbits down and kissed her forehead without a word. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. It had become normal now, the way he saw her, not as broken, not as a burden, but as someone still standing. Later that week, they rode out together, not far, just to a ridge overlooking the valley. The cottonwoods below shimmered in the wind. The river carved its way through the land with tireless grace. Clara looked out and breathed deeply, the scent of pine and thaw and open space filling her chest. Jonah handed her a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "Got it in town last month," he said. "Didn't know if you'd stay." She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a spool of blue thread, finer than anything she'd owned, and a small bound book of blank pages. Clara ran her fingers over the cover, then met his eyes. "I'm not leaving." He nodded once. "Didn't figure you would." They didn't talk about what they were or what would come next. They didn't need to. Each day they shared, mending, planting, laughing when a possum raided their food stores, was its own quiet vow. One night, as the fire burned low and the frogs sang to the stars, Clara traced the lines of Jonah's palm with her finger. "What did you lose?" she asked. He turned his hand, laced his fingers with hers. Enough to know what it means when something stays. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, a hush like breath. Clara leaned into him, resting her head on his chest. His arm came around her slow, protective, like it had always belonged there. In time they built more than a shelter, a fence for a garden, a pen for goats if goats ever came. Jonah found planks in a distant barn and helped patch the old cabin. Clara filled the shelves with jars of dried herbs, seeds, and the tiny bonnets she continued to sew. Each spring the grave bloomed. Each winter they returned to it with fire and stories and silence. And though the world still held storms, still bore the weight of loss, Clara had found what the preacher's sermons and John's empty promises never gave her. Not rescue. Recognition. Jonah had knelt beside her in the cold, lit a fire without asking and stayed, not out of pity, not to save her, but to see her, to weather the silence, to walk forward one day at a time, never forcing her to forget, but reminding her she could still live. And so she did.